All right. So, as I said in my last announcement to you all, uh, with this shift during this coronavirus crisis, it's going to be very difficult for me to respond back to each one of you individually when we're having these discussions. So I'm going to start making regular videos. And for me, this Stephen Kellert's biophilia hypothesis is really one of the more interesting articles that we'll read. I think it gives people a new way of thinking about their relationship to nature and the environment. And I could see that from reading through. I read through all of your comments. You folks are really on top of this, and you're really doing a great job with it, I think. The first question that and I'm going to start doing this too, as I told you in the announcement, I'm going to start posting the questions at the front end so you can look at them if you want. Everything's going to be open to you. You can see the questions that I have about the articles that we'll be reading for the next 5 weeks. And this one is super interesting. I paired it with that few pages, the small section of Wilson, because E.O. Wilson and Stephen Kellert are basically colleagues. They came out with this great book, one of my favorite books of the 90s, The Biophilia Hypothesis. They edited it, and E.O. Wilson wrote a wonderful short book. It's not really a work of science. It's more of a work of, I guess you might call it, I don't know, hypothetical psychology. And he's not a psychologist, but Kellert is. And these two work together for years. This book, The Biophilia Hypothesis, has a number of really wonderful articles. I highly recommend it if you're interested in reading more deeply into this concept. Anyway, so and another couple of things about this idea. I want you to know about this. The University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, that's their main campus of their university, has a landscape and human health laboratory. And it doesn't look to me like a lot of new stuff as material is going up on this page, which could just mean that the university is not funding the Frances Kuo, who's the director. There she is. It's a fascinating idea. If you go to this site and look at some of these articles that have been published by the institution that she started, I'm sure she has a bunch of graduate students working with her and other faculty working with her. If you go look into this landscape and human health laboratory, you'll see that what it's really all about is how green space, how environments and neighborhoods even affect us. We know of this. We know that there's a tremendous psychological effect from green space, as I mentioned in class before. We know from research into this that patients generally heal better when they have ability to look out a window onto a green space, onto trees, or even when there's a painting in the room that represents something in nature that calms and soothes them and allows them to heal faster. Frances Kuo and this institute have found a bunch of different things about the ways that our connection to nature affects our psyche and our response. And so that's something else for you to look into and think about. Here's a really good conversation. I'll put it up there on our website about biophilia with E.O. Wilson. So he and Kellert were thinking about this for many years. So I'm going to start posting these questions. And the first question I want to ask you about this, you've all read it now. What is Kellert doing this article, and how did he arrive at his conclusions? And then importantly, is this article science? Would you call it science? And does it even matter if it's science? So if we were in the classroom, we would have a very interesting discussion, and I'm missing those, of course, but about whether this is science. And it does use data. It's not physical science, it's social science, right? So the data that Kellert is using to come up with his 9 typologies is all listed in that second page of the article, where he goes through all the different articles that he's published over the years. Much of it is his own work that he's citing, but what he did was he surveyed people and found their responses to questions, specific questions, or probably to images that were projected on a screen of, like, say, a grizzly bear or a frog or, whatever else. Read through that. It's very interesting when he talks about the kinds of research that he did to come up with these 9 typologies. And it's super important for you to think about this. What's his central claim, of course? And you can all tell his central claim is, based on these kinds of surveys, we can probably come up with different ways that human beings are affiliate themselves with nature, how nature attracts human beings. And then he comes up with all these different typologies. And he also asks the question of possibly an evolutionary advantage. So what would that mean? That would mean that there may be some kind of hard wiring into human beings, that different kinds of affiliations and affinities for nature would cause the gene pool to expand rather than to contract and die out. So along evolutionary lines, that would mean that this tendency towards doing something would improve the likelihood that you would continue to procreate and create more and more of your genetic offspring. So the evolutionary advantages are so obvious when we go through these different kinds of typologies. Utilitarian is the most obvious one. If you can't see nature as a thing that you can use to improve your chances of survival, avoidance of pain. So if you're looking at a stream and you see fish flowing through it, and you think to yourself, I might be able to eat that fish, then that is a utilitarian value, right? In that kind of affinity, and looking at things and thinking, how can I use this to improve my ability to live? The naturalistic is a kind of a contact high, a fascination, a wonder, an awe with nature. When we do this in the class, I usually like to talk to students about what do they think the word sublime means. And for most people, they think it means like something is really good. But really what sublime means is it's taking you to a place that's below your normal level of consciousness, subliminal. So when you are in awe of something, when you look at a waterfall and you think the power of that is so immense, it's hard for me to conceptualize that in my small, puny human sense, or look at a giant redwood tree or a giant sequoia. That gives you awe. That's sublimity, and that's a naturalistic typology or affinity. Obviously, the ecologistic scientific affinity would be to look at things and try to figure out how they work. Where do they fit in? And Kellett breaks it into ecologistic and scientific, because the ecologistic is the person who's looking at the multiple different ways that things come together. And if you remember from our class, when I pointed out the only graphic that appears in Darwin's Origin of Species, that's the ecologist trying to think at what Leopold called the plane perpendicular to Darwin, across all those different things, whereas the scientific focus is on a single species. This is the kind of taxonomic work that E.O. Wilson is talking about in that section of last section of Half Earth that we just read. Aesthetic, you see some kind of design or beauty or order in things. You look at the sky, you look at a beautiful, like a grove of oak trees, and you say to yourself, my gosh, there's something perfect about the way that's all put together. This is very much Emersonian in the sense of, the cosmos that I've talked to you about. The way the Greeks would talk about cosmos was both two things: beauty, they used it to mean beauty, and order. And so when we look at nature and find some kind of beauty in it, that's the aesthetic value. Like if you look at a mountain, and you may have a naturalistic response to it, like, that's awesome, look at the size of that thing. But you may also have an aesthetic value to it and say, the way it's perfect, it perfects its form. Like if you look at Mount Hood sitting up over, when you're in downtown Portland, or if you climb up into the high peaks in the Trinity Alps and you look across and there you see Mount Shasta, there's an aesthetic value to that. It's beautiful. It seems like a form of perfection. That moves us into the symbolic. You look at nature and you see something about the way it works that gives you a message. It tells you that that's a good thing for you. You could say that the way a stream flows is something that works really well for us. If the humanistic is the way that when you look at nature, you reminded of other humans, of things that happen, like you and your sister and your family go to a specific lake or something, and you look at that lake and it brings back human ideas. The moralistic is that it gives you ethical motivations, ethical concepts when looking at nature. And dominionistic is that beginning of that control over nature. That's when you look at nature and think, how can I make this work for me? That would be like wanting to build a dam, maybe a fishing weir for your catching fish. That's utilitarian, but it's also dominionistic. You look at nature and how do you control it? And then, of course, negativistic is the kind of thing that we definitely would be seeing with our response to a coronavirus, where we look at nature and nature is the thing that's going to kill us. It's the thing that we're afraid of, and so we think about it from the perspective of that's something that could be dangerous to us, and we have to protect ourselves from. Now, when you look at these, would these blend together? Would a society have many more of these, or some of them? Of course, these things, even individuals, we all have some, each of us has some aspect of at least 4 or 5 or 6 of these things, I would think. And the value in this would be, I would think, that you would look at, say, a whole society, a whole culture, and ask yourself, which of these kinds of ways of affinities with nature is this society more connected to? That's one way of thinking about biophilia and Kellert's article. I miss you all, and I hope you're doing well, and I hope you'll watch these videos.